We've been talking about misconceptions a lot in science class. And misconceptions do happen often when people are thinking about scientific phenomenon. But it's not the only place where it happens. You just did a lesson in world cultures where you were set up to develop a misconception about an imaginary group of people called the Nasarima. The Nasarima are actually us. They're Americans. Nasarima is American spelled backwards. But the man who wrote The Body Ritual Among the Nasarima article, Horace Minor, was deliberately trying to get people to think about the fact that if you are expecting strangeness, you will see strangeness. And this is a very common thing that human beings do. All of us, not just you guys, everybody. So when he says in his first paragraph that the magical beliefs and practices of the Nasarima present such unusual aspects that it seems desirable to describe them as an example of the extremes to which human behavior can go, when he says that, he's deliberately setting you up to make an assumption. An assumption is a thing that is accepted as true or as certain to happen without any actual proof. So we all make assumptions because in our everyday lives we don't have time to find proof for every little thing, and that's okay. But when you're trying to use your mind well for an important purpose, when you're really trying to solve an important problem or think carefully about something, you have to avoid assumptions. And the assumption that everybody makes when they read the misconceptions article is that these are strange people who live far away and have nothing in common with us. If you didn't start with that assumption, you would be able to recognize yourself when you read the Nasarima article. It may be hard to avoid making assumptions, but it can be done. And the process of avoiding making assumptions is called the scientific method in science class, but it has a different name in the rest of the world. The ability to think well is referred to as critical thinking. If you're being critical, you're really stopping to analyze what you're doing. And it has 3 important steps, and you can use the acronym RED to remember this. You recognize your assumptions, recognize that everyone has them, and stop and think, what are my assumptions right now about this topic? What are the things that I'm assuming that may or may not be true? The next step is to evaluate any of the arguments that are being presented to you. By evaluate, I mean stop and decide whether or not these are valid arguments. We've used that word, right? Valid. If something's valid, it's well done, it's based on logic and evidence, and if it's a scientific experiment, then it has followed all the rules that we talked about, having an experimental and a control group, having a lot of constants, having no experimental errors, like putting your 2 different beakers too close together so that your temperatures equalize. So you evaluate the quality. You evaluate whether or not this argument is valid. After you do those 2 things, now it's fair to draw a conclusion. And I have to point out here that the word draw is being used figuratively. It's being used, actually, it's not even being used figuratively. The word draw has 2 different meanings. One meaning for the word draw is this, where you draw a house, let's say. But there's another meaning for the word draw, like when you draw 2 strings together, right? It means to pull things together. When you draw conclusions, you pull together all the evidence that was put into your arguments, and then you come up with one final answer. So to draw a conclusion means to come to a conclusion. So you don't want to jump to conclusions based on your assumptions. You want to evaluate your arguments, be aware of the assumptions you're making, and make good, careful, planned conclusions. Critical thinking really matters, and here's why. The world has a lot of problems. It always does. It's not just specific to your generation. Every generation faces challenges out there in the world. But as our world has become more interconnected through the internet, sometimes those problems can seem really overwhelming and close at hand. And the only way to solve problems is to think critically. I think Albert Einstein had one of the best ways of looking at problem solving. He was a great problem solver. Here's what he said. We can't solve problems by using the same kind of thinking we used when we created them. And the lesson to me about the Nasarima is that if you get stuck thinking the same way you always think, you miss a lot of stuff. And when you miss a lot of stuff, you make mistakes. So when you make mistakes about other cultures, what problems are you actually creating or exacerbating or making worse, right? The same thing is true in science. If you continue to believe that, large objects are going to fall faster than small objects, despite whatever scientific evidence comes your way to the contrary, then you're not going to be able to build things that work in the real world because you're basically ignoring physics in favor of your assumptions. So, to sum up, use the tools that I'm giving you and that your social studies teacher is giving you, and that I'm sure all your teachers will give you this year, so that you can use your mind well and be a good problem solver. Use the scientific method when you want to experiment. Use critical thinking when you want to analyze a piece of evidence or an argument. And apply the rules of validity to experiments, hypotheses, theories, models, anything that crosses your path, because this is how you avoid forming big misconceptions. Okay, guys, I'll see you in class.